All right, welcome. Today, we're going to tackle a question that honestly feels like it's never been more important. How does power really work? But here's the twist. We're not going to just look at today's headlines. We're going to use a guide that's about 2,500 years old, the Athenian Empire.
See, it all comes down to this one simple-sounding puzzle. Think about it. At what exact moment does a partnership, a voluntary team-up, tip over into something else entirely? When does helping each other out become, well, just taking orders? That line is almost always blurry, and that's where things get really interesting. To really get a feel for how blurry this line is, let's look at a modern case from our source material. The United States has a major air base in Turkey, at Incirlik. They're NATO allies, right? But what happens when the U.S. uses that base to launch attacks that Turkey doesn't agree with? Who's really in charge then? It's this complex 60-year-old dance of power and interests.
Or, get this, here's an even wilder case. Back in 2016, the U.S. told Egypt to stop a ship. What was on it? 30,000 rocket-propelled grenades from North Korea. And here's the kicker. The weapons were being bought by Egypt. So at the request of a foreign power, one part of the Egyptian government was forced to act against another part. I mean, that's not just influence, right? That's power working deep inside the machinery of another country.
So what we're talking about here has a name. It's called hegemony. And it's not just about who has the biggest army. It's about creating a system where other countries kind of choose to play along. The source calls it quasi-voluntary compliance. They're consenting, sure, but that consent is being heavily shaped by the pressure from the big guy. It's this messy mix of choice and, a little bit of coercion.
And this is where things get really fascinating. These complicated, messy situations we're talking about, they are not a modern invention. The ancient Greeks were wrestling with the exact same kinds of problems back in the 5th century BC with the rise of Athens. So let's dive into their story and see how it completely complicates our whole understanding of power.
So, you probably remember the school book version of this story, right? It's pretty straightforward, and it usually goes something like this.
Okay, so picture this, 478 BC. The Greeks have just fought off this massive Persian invasion. So a bunch of city-states get together and form the Delian League. It's a totally voluntary alliance to keep everyone safe. But then comes this really critical moment in 454 BC. The League's shared bank account gets moved from a neutral island, Delos, to Athens. Fast forward to the 420s, and yeah, nobody's really pretending it's an alliance of equals anymore. It's the Athenian Empire. Sounds simple, right? Like from friends to the boss in just a few steps?
Yeah, well, that simple story, it's hiding a reality that was so much messier, way more dynamic. It turns out this transformation wasn't just a one-way street. It was a constant push and pull.
The source for this explainer puts it a different way. It says, forget the straight line. Think of it more as a conceptual and discursive struggle. What does that mean? It means Athens and its allies were basically in a constant argument, a debate, over what their relationship even was. They were trying to define a brand new kind of political power while they were building it.
And you can see exactly how this struggle played out in some really clever ways. Resistance wasn't always a full-blown war. A lot of it was symbolic. Allies would build their own little treasury buildings on Delos, like a subtle way of saying, hey, we've got our own money too. An aristocrat on some island hired a famous poet to write songs praising Athens' enemies. You have elites who stopped having flashy funerals to blend in with Athens' more democratic vibe. See, these weren't just random acts. They were all ways of pushing back, of negotiating their own space inside this powerful new system.
And this constant back and forth, it actually boiled down to the words they used. I mean, what do you even call a thing like this? Because the name you give it completely shapes how you see it, and ultimately, how you try to control it.
Okay, and this slide gets right to the heart of the matter. We throw around the word empire, and it comes with all this modern baggage, conquest, colonies, direct rule. But the word they used, arche, well, it's a whole different ballgame. It's slippery. It could mean rule, for sure, but it could also just mean the beginning or sovereignty. It wasn't a clear label. It was an idea they were fighting over. That ambiguity was the political battlefield.
So, you might be thinking, why does a 2,500-year-old debate about some Greek word matter to me? Well, because digging into this ancient ambiguity gives us a much, much sharper lens for looking at power today.
As the source says, what happened with Athens isn't some weird, one-off historical event. It's actually a perfect case study for seeing the sneaky ways hegemony works, that blend of choice and force, the fight over meaning, the power of just a single word. It's like getting a new playbook to understand what's really going on between the US and Turkey or the US and Egypt.
And that really leaves us with one big final question. The Athenians and their allies, they were living inside this system every single day, and they still couldn't agree on what to call it or how it worked. So if it was that fuzzy for them, how can we, looking at our own incredibly complex world of alliances and international pressures, pretend that we know for sure who's really pulling the strings?